Alright, thank God it's fantasy football season. I'm Buster Brown, and the show is Redemption Rehab. If you tuned in today, it's for one reason. It's to start winning championships in fantasy football. Today, we're talking about my top picks on the weekly waiver wire that'll help you get the job done. So let's head over to the weekly waiver wire report
and check out the facts.
Alright, it's week 15 of the NFL season. Hopefully, you're in the playoffs and on your way to winning a championship. Well, we're here to help. This week, we're talking waiver wire and people we can bring in to help you fill the holes in your lineup to help win a championship. That's what it's all about, and that's what we're here to do, help you win a championship. So let's head over to the waiver wire
and check out the facts.
Okay, as usual, here we are on our website, fantasyfootballredemptionrehab.com, and we always start out our waiver wire report with running backs. So let's take a look at some of the running backs you should have picked up from last week's episode. Let's start with the San Francisco 49ers, Raheem Mostert, who had 10 rushes for 69 yards with 1 TD. He also had 2 catches for 40 yards and another TD on 2 targets. He played well again this week. If you'd have taken our advice and picked him up last week, you'd have did good. He was a big-time player. With Matt Breida out, he's getting a lot of carries. I'd go out and get him, especially if you've got other players in the San Francisco 49er backfield. Let me give you another guy you should be looking at for this week, and that's the Detroit Lions' Bo Scarborough, who had 19 rushes for 65 yards with 1 reception for 5 yards on 3 targets. He's up against a tough matchup against Tampa Bay this week. But you know what? When you're getting 19 carries, you get near the goal line, which I expect maybe he will. He's going to get a touchdown this week. You watch. So I'd go out and get Bo Scarborough, especially so that if you need a running back, you got one, but keep it away from your opponent. You don't want him getting them. And let me give you another running back you should be eyeing this week, and that's the Pittsburgh Steelers running backs, Benny Snell Jr. or the Kansas City Chiefs running back Darwin Thompson. Benny Snell had 16 rushes for 41 yards and no receptions, and Darwin Thompson had 4 rushes for 7 yards, but he had 4 receptions for 36 yards. We don't know what's going on with the Kansas City backfield, but it looks like they're grooming this guy to be a big-time player next year. But if you need a running back, or maybe you need just a sleeper because you have no other choices, one of these 2 guys will get the job done. So go out and get them if you can. Okay, those are running backs that we mentioned just last week. If you didn't get any of those guys, maybe you didn't like them. I'll tell you what, we've got some guys that did a hell of a job this week. And let's go check out some of those guys, like the Oakland Raiders' DeAndre Washington, who had 14 rushes for 53 yards with 1 TD and 6 receptions for 43 yards on 7 targets, filling in for the injured Josh Jacobs. Look, if you got Josh Jacobs on your team, you gotta pick this guy up. You don't want to go into week 15 without his handcuff, and it's DeAndre Washington. He had a big game, and if Josh Jacobs is out for the year, or maybe they hold him out at the last minute, he'd be worth sticking in there because he had a ton of points this week, and he will next week too. They got a great matchup. Let me give you some other running backs to keep an eye on this week, starting with the Washington Redskins' Chris Thompson, who had 7 receptions for 43 yards on 8 targets. He's getting playing time with the injury to Darius Geist. Look, all they've got is Adrian Peterson, Chris Thompson, and maybe Wendell Smallwood. That's it. I would definitely consider picking Chris Thompson up, especially if you're in a PPR league. I mean, he got you 14 points if he just on catches and yardage alone. If he gets in the end zone, it could balloon to something more like 20-some points. So go out and pick him up, because I don't expect Darius Geist to play probably the rest of the year. Let me give you some other running backs to keep an eye on in case you have a need in week 15, like Patrick Layard, who rushed 15 times for 48 yards and had 4 receptions for 38 yards on 5 targets. Patrick Lard from Miami, who else do they got? They don't have anybody else. This guy played well against a tough Jets defense, and he's got a great matchup against the Giants, and the weather could be a factor. I bet it's cold, and I bet they will try to run the ball. Without Devontae Parker there, it's going to be tough for Miami to win this game, and they're going to rely a lot on Patrick Lard. Let me give you another running back you might want to keep an eye on this week with the injury to Rashad Penny, and that's CJ Prosite. He's played well in the past, and if anything happens to Chris Carson, he's the only thing Seattle has left in the backfield. And I'd be picking him up and stashing him on my bench if I can, especially if you have Chris Carson on your team. I don't expect Rashard Penny to play again anytime soon with the sprained ACL. That hurts. Let's go take a look at some wide receivers that can help you in Week 15. Starting with the ones we mentioned last week that had big weeks in Week 14, and I think will have big weeks again this week. Starting with the Indianapolis Colts' Zach Pascal, who had 5 receptions for 74 yards with 1 TD on 9 targets. Or how about the Chicago Bears' Anthony Miller, who had 3 receptions for 42 yards and another TD on 4 targets. These guys are good players. If they're still on your waiver wire, I'd go out and get them. I think they're going to play well the rest of the year. If T.Y. Hilton comes back, Pascal's going to see less targets, so keep that in mind. But I think Anthony Miller plays well the rest of the year. Let me give you a couple more wide receivers we mentioned last week that's going to help you in Week 15, like the Buffalo Bills' Cole Beasley, who had 4 receptions for 29 yards with 1 TD on 7 targets. Or how about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers' Brashard Perriman, who had 3 receptions for 70 yards with 1 TD on 5 targets. He got extra playing time because of the injury to Mike Evans. I'm not expecting Mike Evans to come back, so I see an uptick for all the Tampa Bay receivers and tight ends. Let's go take a look at some wide receivers that we didn't mention last week that you should keep an eye on this week. Starting with the Pittsburgh Steelers' Deontay Johnson, who had 6 receptions for 60 yards on 8 targets with 1 TD and 1 rush for 20 yards and a punt return for a TD. A true breakout performance. He got extra playing time because of an injury to J.J. Smith-Schuster, but he showed if you give him the ball, he's going to produce. So get out there and get Deontay Johnson if he is on your waiver wire. Let me give you a couple other wide receivers you should pick up this week from the Miami Dolphins, and they are Isaiah Ford, who had 6 receptions for 92 yards on 9 targets, or how about the veteran Allen Hurns, who had 5 receptions for 68 yards on 8 targets. Both got extra playing time because of the injury to Devontae Parker, and they play the New York Giants' weak secondary in Week 15. The weather's going to play a big part in that game. If it's super cold, I'd avoid these guys. But who they're going to throw the ball to without Devontae Parker? These guys stepped up last week, and one of them or both could have a big game this week. Let me give you a couple more wide receivers to keep an eye on, like the 2 Indianapolis Colts' Marcus Johnson and Paris Campbell. Marcus Johnson had 3 receptions for 105 yards with 1 TD on 7 targets, and Paris Campbell, who's coming back from a hand injury. Both obviously can play. So if I was you, I'd keep an eye on these guys. If you find out T.Y. Hilton's not going to play this week, you might want to stash one or both of these guys on your bench just in case you need a wide receiver for this week. Let me give you a couple deep sleepers in case you're in a bind at wide receiver, and that's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers' Justin Watson, who had 5 receptions for 59 yards with 1 TD on 8 targets. Or how about the Houston Texans' Kiki Kute, who had 5 receptions for 68 yards on 8 targets. Or maybe even Kendrick Bourne for the San Francisco 49ers, who managed to come up with 2 TDs. He's done this in the past. He has a big game and then you don't hear about him for a while. I'd be careful with these guys because they have a chance to put up a donut next week. But if you're in need, these are some deep sleepers that can help you win a championship in 2019. Let's go take a look at some tight ends that we mentioned last week that you should have picked up for your team, like The Los Angeles Rams' Tyler Higbee, who has 7 receptions for 116 yards on 11 targets. We've been mentioning Tyler Higbee and Gerald Everett all year, and they've produced when they play. If Gerald Everett doesn't come back from injury, expect Tyler Higbee to have another big game in Week 15. Let me give you a couple other guys we mentioned last week, like the Seattle Seahawks' Jacob Hollister, who had 4 receptions for 34 yards on 6 targets. Or how about the Indianapolis Colts' Jack Doyle, who only had 2 receptions for 27 yards but 6 targets. Look, these guys, sometimes they come up big and get a touchdown, but they're touchdown-dependent tight ends. If you think they're in a good matchup and you think that maybe weather's going to be a factor for weeks 15 and 16 across the country, it's going to be cold, it's going to be wet. Teams are going to want to throw to their tight ends, especially in Seattle and especially in Indy. So make sure you take a look at these guys, and if you need a tight end, you might want to put them on your bench. We've mentioned these guys for weeks, but let me give you some guys that came up this week, like the Denver Broncos' Noah Fant, who had 4 receptions for 113 yards and 1 TD on 4 targets. We've mentioned Noah Fant all year. He's probably not on your waiver wire, but you know what? If he is, go get him. He's a rookie. He's out of Iowa, and they seem to produce tight ends. So I think he's going to be viable the rest of the year. So go get him. Let me give you some other guys that did good at tight end in Week 14 that can help you this week, like the Baltimore Ravens' Hayden Hurst and Nick Boyle. Hayden Hurst had 3 receptions for 73 yards with 1 TD on 3 targets. Nick Boyle had 2 receptions for 10 yards and a TD on 3 targets. With the injury to Mark Andrews, who might not play this week, Ravens like to throw the ball to the tight end. So I'd go out and get one of these guys. Maybe one of them will have a big game this week against the New York Jets. Let me give you another tight end that had a big week in Week 14, and that's the Carolina Panthers' Ian Thomas, who had 5 receptions for 57 yards with 1 TD on a whopping 10 targets. That's a lot of targets. He got a lot of playing time because of the injury to Greg Olsen. Greg Olsen's thinking about retirement. Fired their coach in Carolina. They're not going to make the playoffs. I think they're going to be looking to get some young guys in there to see what they can do. Ian Thomas is one of them. So don't be surprised if he gets another game where he's got 5 to 10 targets and even more touchdowns. So keep an eye on Ian Thomas of the Carolina Panthers. Let me give you some sleeper tight ends to keep an eye on in case you're in a deeper league or maybe just in a bind. And that is the Jacksonville Jaguars' Nick O'Leary, who had 4 receptions for 30 yards with 1 TD on 5 targets, or a real deep sleeper, Josh Hill, who could see more playing time with the injury to Jared Cook. I'm not sure what New Orleans is going to do down there without Jared Cook. He took another concussion. I think that might be his second one this year, so he's going to miss some time. And if he does, Josh Hill's his handcuff or backup at tight end. I wouldn't count on him, but you know, if you really need a tight end, it's a possibility this guy can produce. So let's go take a look at some quarterbacks that we haven't mentioned in a while that have some good matchups in Week 15 of the NFL season. Some quarterbacks we haven't mentioned in a long time, haven't exactly produced a ton of points lately, but they might be on your waiver wire. And the reason you want them is because they have good matchups and they're playing in domes. That's important this time of year. A quarterback that got you here may be playing in bad weather this weekend. The ball, it's going to be hard to move the ball. It's going to be hard to throw the ball. And the worst thing about it is they're going to be freezing for the first time all year, especially if they're a dome team or a warm weather team. I'm telling you, it's crippling. That's how cold it gets in the north. So let's take a look at some quarterbacks that don't have that problem that might be on your waiver wire, like the Cleveland Browns' Baker Mayfield versus the Arizona Cardinals. Or how about Jacoby Brissett versus the New Orleans Saints? Both have risks. Both have played good and have played bad. But the weather plays a big part in Week 15 and 16, and we're trying to win a championship. The quarterback that got you here might not be a viable start just because of the weather. These are 2 viable quarterbacks on top of the ones we've mentioned in the past. So go back any chance you get, and you can always go back and look at any of the videos that we've done just by coming over here to like Week 14 and clicking on that arrow there, and it will show you waiver wire strategies that we've mentioned in the past, go to our website and check it out. Let's take a look at some kickers that can help you in week 15 of the NFL season. As far as kickers that I'm going to recommend this week, there's been a change down in Dallas. Kai Forbath replaces Brett Meyer down in Dallas. The weather down in Dallas is good. I would consider picking him up if you need a kicker for week 15. And I would only play kickers this week because the championship is on the line that play in domes or play in good weather games. And the point total has to be high. If that doesn't have a high point total, then you know what? You might want to look for another kicker. The more points, the better for your kicker's chances to score. In summary, it's playoff time. We can't afford to lose. So if you have players playing in bad weather, maybe they just have a bad matchup that week, or maybe they have a nagging injury, they could all these reasons could cost them points this week. You should take some of our advice and replace them with some of the position players we mentioned this week on the Waiver Wire Report. I'm Buster Brown, the show's Redemption Rehab. Good luck.